inside. Worker man got no life. Worker man in so much pain. He cried like pouring rain. Who what you working for? God and family want no more. Who what you working for? God and family want no more. Worker man, oh. Worker man, oh yeah. Worker man, oh yeah. There's a place in Washington, D.C. that I love to go when I go there. And it's Arlington Cemetery. I love to walk up and down the rows because I like to be reminded of the people that it took to preserve the integrity of the freedoms that we enjoy sitting here tonight. Freedom comes at a great cost. There was a speech that took place at Lincoln Memorial by a man named Martin Luther King. And in that speech, he said, "I have a dream." And for years and years and years and years, that speech has played over and over and over and over in my brain and in my heart. In these days, it feels and seems like the world is kind of on fire. A lot of chaos, right? and a lot of animosity, a lot of tension, a lot of not love. And as David and I talk over time, we've talked a lot about the power of love and some of the potentials and possibilities that might be there. And that's where this song comes from. I have a dream that one day all men will be free, free from the pain and shame all around you and me. When will we ever learn to love each other? When will we ever see all men as brothers? We are all islands unto our own selves, rocks of Gibraltar in need of some help. Why can't we be loved? Why can't we be loved? Love enough to change the world. Love enough to change the world. I have a dream that one day all men will be free. No bombs blasting, no more enemies. Never been to Flanders Fields, been to Arlington. Seen all the graves thereof, too many mothers' sons. We are all islands unto our own selves, rocks of Gibraltar in need of some help. Why can't we be loved? Why can't we be loved? Love enough to change the world. Love enough to change the world. Why can't we be loved? won't stop praying on my knees until then. Oh, when we be loved, why can't we be loved? Love enough to change the world. Love enough to change the world. Why can't we be loved? 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 As I mentioned earlier, in late 2013, early 2014, I had some gaps. I had mind fog. I had some disconnects that were going on, and my wife, Chris, this January 8th will be 37-year anniversary, and I trust her a lot. If she's ever been wrong, I can't tell you one time. And I know she's been wrong, but I can't tell you that one time. She said, Dan, I think you love me a lot and you love our kids a lot, but I think there's some real disconnects. And I know you've tried and tried and tried to get help, but I think you need to maybe think about seeing a counselor. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. Because my experience to that point was not very positive. But Chris, being the amazing person that she is, had already identified someone that I could check out. And it was Dr. David Stevens. And he's a man just like me, feet on the ground. But he's amazingly gifted, and he loves people a lot. And he has so many amazing skills and experience. And out of that amazing heart that he loves people and truly wants to help people to the point of cure and not just symptom treatment and coping. I sit here tonight almost 100% recovered and healed in my brain from concussions. I don't know how many. Thank you. I grew up playing football and hockey, and when you hit people, your coach loves that. And when he can count on you to be an enforcer to protect some of the other players, growing up in Minnesota, playing hockey was everything. And then going on to Canada and all the way to the point of playing hockey and getting an invitation to play for the LA Junior Kings. But discovering that was not my destiny. My destiny was to do music, not that. And so, growing up playing hockey, there were many times where I would get hit and I'd wake up in the hospital, or I'd wake up in an ambulance, or I'd wake up in ICU, and they would do all kinds of testing, and then they'd say, you're good to go. Go on, march on, keep hitting people, play well. Not having any idea what damage I was doing to myself. Not even knowing that I needed help, or that help was even available or possible. And so, again, it's with a great sense of humble heart that I'm so excited to introduce Dr. David Stevens to you.
Thanks, Dan. We're so excited that everybody could be here tonight. It may seem a little bit strange, maybe it doesn't, but to have music and then talk about brain function and then music and talk about brain function, we're going to do some alternating back and forth. But really, the two are very much complementary. there's some really very new research going on about the effect music has on the brain. And in some ways, I apologize that you have to listen to me instead of more of Dan's music all night. It's kind of a hard act to follow. But so we're going to tag team back and forth tonight. I'm going to talk about some things that are pretty complex, some things that are pretty cutting edge, but try to do it in pretty direct terms. Hopefully it'll be fairly straightforward. We want to really respect your time tonight, but at the same time, feel free to ask questions as we're going along. If something isn't clear, if you don't know exactly what I'm talking about, ask questions, and if we need to speed up in certain places, I can do that. If I need to eliminate something or put some things together, we'll do that, but I want to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. It's so critical to understand the brain and its function. All of us, I think, intuitively we know the brain controls the body. Intuitively we know the brain controls thoughts. Intuitively we know the brain controls emotions and behaviors, but we don't really think about it day in and day out. We don't think about the effect the brain has on our physical functioning. We don't think about the effect the brain has even on our emotional functioning and our behavior and our relationships. So we're going to talk about that. Really, this first part of the talk tonight is going to be an introduction to brain function, but I also want to start with the inspiration for the work that I'm doing. The inspiration for the talk tonight comes from the leading neuroscientist alive. This is a person that if I would say to you his name, you would be familiar with him, but not in the context of brain function, not in the context of neuroscience, but in other contexts. We'll get to that kind of at the end, but he really, truly is a Renaissance man doing things in many different fields, but his work in neuroscience is unbelievable. So let's start with kind of a quick overview of brain function. The first thing you need to know, and I'll come back to this time and again this evening, is that the brain is what's called a self-organizing system. What that means is the brain detects what's happening in your body, the brain detects what's happening in itself, the brain detects what's happening around you, and is continuously not only looking for threats, responding to those threats, but organizing the best response. Does it need to be an emotional response? Does it need to be a behavioral response? Is it, and we'll talk much more about this, is it allocating fuel to one part of the brain versus a different part of the brain? When you get knocked on your rear end playing football or hockey and you can't remember the next play, the brain organizes ways to keep you functioning, to adapt even on the football field, even on the hockey rink, ice, even on the basketball court. Let me stick to what I know. But the brain self-organizes, adjusts, and helps us keep functioning. Dan, you functioned for years and years and years with accumulating concussions and accumulating traumatic brain injuries, and yet you were composing amazing music, you were playing amazing music, you were functioning in a variety of occupational endeavors. So the brain, due to, again, to its self-organizing function, keeps us going even with accumulating injuries. So let's talk about 4 overall major brain functions. First of all, like I already alluded to, the brain is continuously scanning our bodies and itself looking for threats. The next thing it does is when it detects a threat, it has to explain to us what that threat is. In order for you to protect yourself, your brain has to come up with an explanation for this is what happened, this is what you need to do to keep yourself safe, this is what you need to do to maintain relationship, this is what you need to do to maintain your job. So the brain is always interpreting. The brain interprets things very, very logically always, but often inaccurately when it doesn't possess the right or sufficient information. So the brain can tell you, like for example, I don't know if anybody's ever had this experience, I certainly have not, Amy, that come home from work and greet your spouse and they're busy doing something and they say, oh, hi, good to see you, and then they're back to whatever it is they're doing. It's easy in that situation to interpret, oh, did I do something wrong? In my case, did I forget to bring the mail in? Did I not get the newspaper from the driveway? Did I do something wrong? And that's very often the interpretation, that if you're not welcomed with open arms and an enthusiastic kiss, then it must be something I did wrong. And almost always that's an inaccurate interpretation. The other person is doing something that they need to be doing, and they're focused on other things, and it doesn't mean they're upset with you or they love you less or anything else. It means they're doing other things, but your brain interprets this is what's going on. Then the next thing the brain does is it automates everything. In order for us to be efficient, for us to get anything done, we have to automate. Like Dan, you probably don't have to look at your fingering every single time for every chord, do you? You don't have to think about how you're strumming and fingering the chords. That's automated. We don't have to think about how to tie our shoes. We just do it. We don't have to think about often our cell phone password, that it is just there, and probably all of you have had the experience I've had. When you change your password, you keep typing in the old one for a while. That's because it's automated. So the brain automates everything. So it scans and detects threats, it interprets those threats, and then it automates those interpretations. So that's very important for you to understand as we move forward. And I'm going to get some of what I promise is water. So keep those principles in mind, that the brain is a self-organizing system. It scans everything, it interprets everything, and automates. So now and then the next thing that's probably the most important, and this is, I would say, as objective as I can be, the biggest, most important discovery about brain function, maybe in the last 20 years, maybe the last 50 years. It is critical to understand this next part for each of your brains to function the way they should, to recover if you've had any of what I'm going to describe as a glucose-limiting injury. But the brain must be fueled. If the brain doesn't have adequate fuel, it will not function the way it should. I heard there was an advertisement on my phone the other day about this mixture of chemicals called redwood. Anybody heard of that? It's supposed to improve blood flow to your brain. And a guy was on there saying, I had all these problems. I had surgery on my parietal lobe in my brain, and I couldn't think and this and that. And so I put together this concoction of tree bark, and I'm trying to remember what else was in there. But anyway, some 2 or 3 substances. And he said, this improved brain flow, or blood flow to my brain, and I started feeling better. There is some truth to when there's better blood flow to your brain that you will feel better in the moment. There's a lot of research and work being done on oxygenating the brain. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, but that if you get oxygen to your brain, it will function better. There's a treatment called hyperbaric oxygen treatment, and that is getting into an incredibly expensive piece of machinery, getting an oxygen-rich environment, and that is supposed to heal your brain. It does help in the moment, but there isn't any research support that it helps long-term. What's missing, and what has been missing from the field of brain science, is understanding the fueling of the brain. And so the primary fuel for the brain is glucose. If you got out your phone right now even, and Googled fuel for the brain, what would come up is glucose. If you don't have fuel, it doesn't matter if you have oxygen, extra oxygen to your brain. If you don't have fuel, it doesn't matter if the blood flow is better. You have to have the fuel for your brain to work the way it should. And so now I'm going to transition a bit to what I'm calling glucose-limiting injuries. So when a variety of things happen that I'll explain to you, what happens is your brain gets persistently and accumulatingly less fuel with every injury, with every event. So everybody in this room has had the experience, whether you realized it or not, of lessening fuel to your brain. the brain can really adapt to several of those injuries. If you lose 5 or 10% of the fuel to your brain, how many have heard of the term neuroplasticity? Basically, that means your brain can adapt, it can adjust to an injury, to a difficult situation. And again, back to that self-organizing system. If some parts of functions aren't working the way they should, the brain will kind of call on other parts of the brain that do that same function, so you don't really notice any difficulty. But after you've had enough injuries, which I'll describe, then it gets to where you can't adjust anymore, you can't adapt anymore. And we'll talk about the symptoms, immediate physical symptoms, as well as longer-term symptoms that come from not having enough fuel. So there's a broad category called glucose-limiting injuries, and there's 3 levels of them. The first is what I call covert concussive injuries. And so that can be as simple as I come over here and I drop my pen, and I'm not actually going to do it, but reach down and grab. One thing my brain doesn't do is multitask electronically. So drop my pen, reach down to get it. If I come back up and hit my head on this table, pretty likely that's a covert concussive injury. That can be enough to limit glucose to my brain, even though it's a very minute amount of limitation. If you have a situation where, and probably nobody's ever had this happen either, but your brother or sister hides in the hall when you're little and jumps out and scares you, and your heart is pounding, being afraid, being startled, having the fight or flight reaction, or minor bumps on the head, all cause a chemical reaction that limits glucose. And so you get a little less fuel to your brain. And it's hard to be alive and be the age of even some of the younger ones of us in here and not have had, it's hard to know the exact number, but 10 or 20 or 30 or more of those glucose or those covert concussive injuries. So a lot of times when I'm assessing people, I'll say, have you had a concussion? Well, no, I've never had a concussion. And many times it's just they didn't realize there was a concussion. So sometimes I'll ask a little more pointed questions. Have you ever been in a motor vehicle accident? Did you ever fall off the monkey bars at school? Were you ever dropped off the changing table? Did you ever fall down the stairs? And then, oh, well, yeah, and kind of the most interesting example was, so I was talking to a woman, and she said, well, you know, there was that time, maybe 10 years ago, when I had a car accident and I went through the windshield. Could that have been a concussion? And I said, yeah, that probably was. That is not the covert concussive injury. That's an actual concussion or a traumatic brain injury. So the first category that happens to all of us, probably a couple of times a year, maybe even more often than that, is those covert concussive injuries, but they all, each time it happens, and I'll explain how, but limits the glucose that's getting to your brain. So your brain is getting less and less and less fuel. Then there's concussions like we talked about. Anybody, well, you don't need to raise your hand, but probably I would guess most of you would think, well, I've had 2 or 3 or 4 concussions or less in my life. That's pretty common that people think, oh no, I really didn't ever have any. Many people have ones that they don't realize that are severe enough to see stars in their vision, to see black spots in their vision, maybe to be unconscious for 5 or 10 seconds, to be playing football and forget the plays. That didn't ever happen to you, did it, man? To slip on the ice and hit the back of your head and feel kind of dazed for a while, to feel a little groggy, to have a headache, all of those are concussive injuries. Those are a little more serious. Those limit glucose a little bit more. Then, of course, there's the traumatic brain injury, and that's where you lose consciousness for hours to days. And probably the most severe traumatic brain injury I've treated was a guy that he went through the windshield of a car at 120 miles an hour, and he was in a medically induced coma for 30 days. And as you can well imagine, that severely limited, just that one incident, severely limited the glucose or the fuel to his brain. So all of us have had glucose-limiting injuries. And all of us have had enough to where we may have some symptoms that we didn't really ever think about as having anything to do with a glucose. Of course, you didn't think that it had anything to do with losing or limiting glucose, but probably didn't think it had anything to do with your head whatsoever. Like, has anybody here on their own ever thought, oh man, I probably have lost some glucose today? Nobody's ever thought that on their own, right? But that again is the primary problem in many, many, many life difficulties, and we'll talk about the specifics of those. But so when you have these glucose-limiting injuries, then your function starts to deteriorate. And how many of you have ever had a headache? Yeah, almost everybody, right? Anybody ever have more than one headache a week? Or multiple headaches? Sometimes people have headaches all day, every day. Nobody thinks that a headache is due to inadequate glucose, but it is. The brain is designed to give us multiple signals when we're low on fuel, but we haven't ever known how to interpret those before. So a headache, a brain fog where you just kind of feel in a daze, tinnitus or ear ringing, pressure in your head, anxiety, irritability, depression, all of those things are symptoms of inadequate fuel to your brain. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I got a headache because I was dehydrated. Or I got a headache because sinuses. Or I got a headache because I didn't have enough sleep. So we have all kinds of explanations, but almost always a headache is due to insufficient glucose due to these injuries. So let's talk about how that happens. So when you bump your head, and it, like I said, it does not have to be that hard. You don't have to lose consciousness. You don't have to see stars. When you are startled, when you have that fight or flight response, when there's physical, emotional, sexual abuse, when any of those things happen, the sympathetic nervous system, which is what is triggered when you have that fight or flight or freeze response, or when you bump your head. The sympathetic nervous system is triggered, and this isn't exactly what happens, but it's close. The brain kind of opens up the valve from your body to let more glucose in, so there's enough fuel to respond to that situation. So you have enough energy in your brain to fight or to flee or even to just freeze and pay attention to what's going on around you. When that happens, the brain gets too much glucose. It comes in too fast, and that causes a condition called hyperglycolysis, meaning your brain is getting too much glucose too fast. If that continues for any length of time, that becomes dangerous. So what the brain will do is, it's like it turns the valve down to limit the amount of glucose coming in. It does it in the moment, and that turns off the hyperglycolysis, but it also does it permanently because the brain wants to prevent a future episode of hyperglycolysis. So then the next time you bump your head, the next time you're startled, the next time you slip and fall on the ice, whatever, that process happens again. The brain opens up the valve, even though it was limited, lets enough glucose in to deal with the crisis. That causes hyperglycolysis. The brain responds by turning the valve off even a little more than the first time, so you get even less glucose. The next time, same process, the brain turns the valve down even a little bit more. So each injury is cumulative. You lose more and more and more fuel with each one of them, and you lose more and more function with each of those injuries. Anybody in here ever heard of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy? That's what a lot of NFL players have been diagnosed with. A number of years ago, there was a bunch of NFL players that shot themselves in the chest because they were incredibly suicidal, horribly depressed, they were rageful, and they had no idea what was going on, so they wanted their brain to be preserved so it could be studied, and maybe somehow, some way, somebody could figure out what's wrong with them. That was based on accumulating injuries. When you play football, you get a bunch of these covert concussive injuries, not enough to go to the sideline and have the blue tent put over you and get examined, but enough to cause this chemical problem. And so they add up and add up and add up and add up and add up, and pretty soon the person is horribly depressed. Pretty soon they're suicidal. I treated a little girl probably a year and a half ago, and she had had a bunch of concussions even at the age of 11. She was a soccer player and had had some bicycle accidents and car accidents. She was having she said, at 11 years old, 100 suicidal thoughts a day. And that was because she was getting progressively less and less and less and less fuel to her brain, and her brain was responding. Remember what I said, the brain interprets or scans and detects problems and interprets it. So the brain was interpreting more and more and more and more and more problem, which led her to become progressively more depressed and progressively more suicidal. So, in my opinion, the most important factor and function of the brain is glucose or fuel to the brain, and understanding how that glucose gets limited. Let me check my notes here for a second to make sure I don't forget anything. Any questions while I do that? Yes? She said, can a lot of stress or a high level of stress tell me if I'm understanding your question, cause that reaction in the brain and the glucose limitation? Is that? And the answer to that is that does not typically cause the glucose limiting injury, but what it does is high level of stress burns glucose faster. So all of us are burning glucose right now. Some of you are burning a lot trying to stay awake. Others of you are burning a lot trying to process the great music Dan had played, but all of us right this second are burning glucose. When you sleep, you're burning glucose. Any increase in physical activity, any increase in mental activity, any increase in emotional exertion burns glucose faster. So, to your question, when you have high stress, you're burning glucose faster than normal, and when you have a glucose limitation and then burn the available fuel at a faster rate than normal, you get glucose depleted. And that causes the same symptoms that we've talked about. That causes headaches and brain fog and pressure in your head and light and sound sensitivity and anxiety and depression and irritability. So even just burning it too fast causes a problem. Yeah, right. Yes. You can take glucose and that will get rid of headaches. And I'll expand on that more later, but again, the short answer is yes. Really, there's a lot of misperception and confusion about what a concussion is, about what a traumatic brain injury is. People use the terms concussion and mild traumatic brain injury interchangeably. Basically, a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury typically involves headaches and tiredness and flashes of light in your vision, and loss of consciousness may be up to 30 seconds or a minute. Anything beyond that is considered a traumatic brain injury. So that's really how we differentiate. Yeah. And everything that you do, inhaling, requires more effort on the part of your lungs, which burns more fuel or more glucose and burns it faster, so that has an effect on your brain's or cognitive functioning. Taking psychotropic medication, taking physical medication, taking marijuana, taking methamphetamine, whatever, your brain has to process that chemical. So that burns fuel more quickly. It takes more brain resource to process that. And so then that just makes the situation of limited glucose worse. So I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about some of the conditions. I talked about physical symptoms already. Let me talk about some of the conditions that come from glucose-limiting injuries, and then I'll turn it back over to Dan. But there's really quite a list. One of the ones I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on was self and other harm. People are aware, I don't know how many of you are aware of the increasing suicide rate in El Paso County, particularly among teenagers and adolescents. That is an enormous problem. But suicide in general is an increasing problem across our country, not just in Colorado. In Colorado, from 2004 to 2017, there were 13,000 completed suicides. So 1,000 a year, which is horrible. And then you're probably aware, or maybe some of you have heard, there was another school shooting, not in Colorado, but I believe it was yesterday. And I believe 2 people died, and then I think the gunman died this morning. And all of us are aware of really the proliferation of acts of mass violence. Those are due, in my opinion, suicidality and acts of mass violence or any kind of violence are due to these accumulated glucose-limiting injuries. Like I mentioned to you before, the NFL players that had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, they were so angry, full of rage, they would destroy their houses. They would sometimes attack their spouses. They became progressively more and more violent. That guy I told you about that went through the windshield at 120 miles an hour, when I first met him, he said, "It's everything I can do to not fight everybody I see." People get more and more and more and more angry as they have less and less glucose. One of glucose's functions is to control and manage our emotions, to control and manage our behavior. As we have less and less and less glucose, we have less and less and less ability to control our emotional reactions and our behaviors. As injuries accumulate, people typically, anxiety comes first. It's one of the earlier symptoms of glucose-limiting injuries, and then depression follows. Depression is usually a little more severe because the brain is interpreting, and I'll talk more about this after Dan plays, but the brain is interpreting the progressive self-insufficiency. It starts at the lower level with the covert concussive injuries like, maybe I'm not good enough. Well, maybe there's something wrong with me. Well, maybe other people are better than me. As the injuries accumulate, then it becomes, well, I'm kind of a failure. Well, I'm a failure as a parent, I'm a failure in my job, I'm a failure in my relationship. And then as they accumulate, then it's I'm completely worthless. And when you get to the completely worthless stage, then there's increasing thoughts of, why do I stay alive? If I don't matter, if I mess up everything, if I hurt everybody, then there's really no point in my life. And so that's when people become at greater and greater risk of suicide. But again, it ties back to these glucose-limiting injuries. So, a huge societal problem caused by this. Yes?
So you're saying that...
Yes. And our thoughts are generated, kind of not surprisingly, by our brain. And when our brain is injured, remember, the brain is a self-organizing system, and it interprets everything. Nobody's brain in here on its own ever thought, I don't have enough glucose and I'm injured and I just need to recover. It's, there's something wrong with me, and then the brain tries to explain what's wrong with me. And then, like if you fail a test, what's wrong with me is I'm not very good in school. Or if parents say, you need to clean up your room and you didn't, and then they say, why are you being so lazy? Then you can latch on to, what's wrong with me is I'm lazy. Or what's wrong with me is other people don't like me. Or what's wrong with me is other people reject me for reasons of my unworthiness. So those thoughts continue to get progressively worse as the glucose-limiting injuries mount. So a couple of other things, and I'll really talk just about broad categories in the interest of time, but mental illness, whether it's anxiety or depression or obsessive-compulsive disorder or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, all of the mental illnesses, in my research and in my opinion, are caused by glucose-limiting injuries. As the injuries accumulate, the brain can't manage emotions anymore. The brain can't manage behavior anymore. The brain can't pay attention to things like it needs to anymore. So those things are due to these accumulating injuries. Autism and other developmental disorders are due to accumulating injuries. Yeah. And so, kind of related to Ronnie's question, short-term versus long-term memory, dementia, it's fascinating. Now, if you see it, even in the popular media, people are starting to refer to Alzheimer's as a glucose problem, that it's a glucose-caused injury. So dementia is, over a lifetime, accumulating injuries, more and more and more and more injuries. And so then the short-term memory doesn't work the way it should. Long-term memory is usually preserved because those memories were formed when you had more fuel available. In the moment, you start to not remember what's going on because you don't have fuel available now to consolidate those memories. So really, mental illness, developmental disabilities, behavioral problems, self and other violence, all of those things are due to these glucose-limiting injuries. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan. When we come back, I'm going to talk about the psychological ramifications of that and then treatment, like Ronnie referenced with his question. Right?
Just sitting in this room, I'm just sitting in this room, I'm just staring at my shoes, I'm just wondering what to do, I'm just staring at my shoes. Then I turn to watch the sky, watch the world pass by. I can't move and I wonder why, as the world just passed me by. I'm just sitting in this room, I'm just staring at my shoes, I'm just wondering what to do, I'm just staring at my shoes. Then I turn to watch TV, staring at the color screen. Disengaged, I want to scream. I can't wake up from this dream. I'm just sitting in this room, I'm just staring at my shoes, I'm just wondering what to do, I'm just staring at my shoes. Then I turn to live for more, to help the ones I'm living for, have all they need and so much more. But I can't walk through my front door, I'm just sitting in this room, I'm just staring at my shoes, I'm just wondering what to do, I'm just staring at my shoes, I'm just staring at my shoes, I'm just staring at my shoes. We were having breakfast at Omelet Parlor the last week of October, and David and I were just talking about some of the different things that happen, and I knew I was not a stupid person, but I could not get beyond so many frustrations and anxieties and things just spinning out of control inside. I tried and tried and tried to help my wife and kids, and I wanted to create a certain quality of life for them. And then I'd work a job, and I'd work with every cell of focus that I could throw into it to try and achieve success and try and serve well and help others. And it'd fall short. And I couldn't figure out the disconnect. I couldn't figure out, I'd experienced enough success on enough different levels, but it was like I kept hitting this ceiling and I couldn't figure out how to get beyond it. And so for me, to be able to sit here tonight and be able to memorize lyrics again, to be able to be present in the present and pay attention to what my wife is saying, and then 3 days later when she asked me about something about that conversation, I remember that conversation because I was listening and I was able to be present in the present. Is exciting to me. There's hope. You don't have to stay there. And I'm so excited that there's hope beyond hope that turns to reality of a quality of life that I never even knew was possible to get to. Oh, I know I can see far beyond these clouds covering me. Oh, I know I can see brighter days are coming to me. Oh, I can see these storm clouds raging. They try to take me down. Try to take me down. Oh, I can see these storm clouds raging. Try to take me down. Try to take me down. Oh, I know I can see brighter days are coming to me. Oh, I know I can see brighter days are coming to me. Oh, trials and troubles come and go. They try to break me down, try to break me down. Oh, trials and troubles come and go. They try to break me down, try to bring me down. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I know I can see brighter days are coming to me. Oh, I know I can see brighter days are coming to me. Brighter days are coming to me. Brighter days are coming to me.
There's a couple of more things actually about the physiological function of the glucose limitation that I need to explain, and then I'm going to go, like I said, into talking about some of the psychological things that happen from these glucose limiting injuries. So the brain fuels itself from the brain stem outward. The brain stem is located right back in here and in the middle of your brain. The brain stem is responsible for respiration, for heart beating, for digestion, for sleep. In other words, the things that keep you alive. The self-organizing function of the brain makes sure that the brain stem gets glucose first, because if your brain stem doesn't have glucose, you're dead. So that's kind of a high priority, right? Then the next level of the brain is the mid-level. And so that gets fuel or glucose next. That's responsible, that's like where the relay station of the brain is. Information coming in from your body goes to that middle level of your brain and then goes to your brain for processing. Information from your brain goes to that part of the brain and then out to the body. That part of the brain controls your balance. It controls your muscle movement. It controls your strength. That's the mid-level of the brain. That gets fuel next, because that's the next most important for survival. Then, when there's enough fuel, then the outermost layer of your brain, or the lobes of your brain, get fuel last. The lobes of your brain are where things like thinking and memory and judgment and decision-making and vision and language, all those skills are. And that gets fuel last. The brain can shut that off first, because you're not going to die if you can't completely process visual information. You're not going to die if you can't remember a word you want to use. So that gets fuel last, and the brain prioritizes in its self-organizing function. Brainstem, middle of the brain first, then outward to the mid part of the brain that controls all of the muscle functions, and then the outward layer. So quick story, I'm currently treating a guy, and he's almost finished with treatment, but he had, who knows, 50 concussions maybe growing up. Then he went to prison and was assaulted a bunch of times and had a bunch more concussions. And then he was working on a construction crew, driving a front-end loader, and the dirt collapsed beneath him, and the bobcat he was in rolled over, hit his head, lost consciousness for a couple hours. So I've been treating him for about 8 or 9 months now. And about 4 or 5 months ago, he decided kind of unwisely to stop taking some of his physical health medications, and he had a family crisis where his daughter ran away and disappeared for several days. Like you were talking about, high stress. So not only did he have a significant glucose limitation, but he was burning fuel at an enormously fast rate. So I get a call from him one morning, I cannot move my arms and legs, which was a little disconcerting. And so I said to him, well, first of all, call the paramedics, call the ambulance. You need to get to the hospital just in case this is a stroke or something. But I said, keep taking your glucose. And within about, probably 6 or 8 hours, all of his muscle function returned, and he was able to walk and move his arms and legs normally. Because of him burning so much fuel so fast and having limited fuel to begin with, his brain prioritized, I need to shut down that mid-level of the brain. I need to shut down moving arms and legs to preserve fuel so there's enough for the brainstem to keep you alive. Then when his fuel level went back up, then all of his arms and legs and motor movements returned. So an example of how the brain prioritizes deepest level of the brain first outwardly, and those functions. Keeping you alive is the highest priority, then muscle movement and strength, and then thinking and memory and judgment and all those higher order functions. So let's talk for a few minutes about the psychological part of this. The brain, like we've talked about, detects any problem in your body and in itself. So the brain is acutely aware when there's any glucose limitation because of glucose's primary importance, not only to keep you alive, but for your functioning. So the brain detects a glucose shortage, and it interprets there's a glucose insufficiency. But all of us have a checklist in our brains about what an injury is. So hopefully this doesn't happen, but if you tripped on the way out of here and fell, you would probably look at your hands to see if the skin was torn. You would look to see if there was blood. You would look to see if there was swelling. You would look to see if there's discoloration. Those are the templates or the criteria or checklist our brain uses to tell us if we're injured or not. When you have one of these glucose-limiting injuries, either there's no blood or no swelling, but if there is that, it goes away in a matter of a couple days to a couple of weeks. And what do you conclude if you have a cut and then the scab is gone and the skin is back to normal? What do you conclude? Healed. You're healed, right? There's no more injury, right? So the brain doesn't keep detecting blood and bruising and swelling. So even if there was that, and there isn't in psychological injuries, of course, And I just want to take a second to reinforce psychological trauma, fight or flight reaction, high fear causes exactly the same chemical problem and limitation as a concussion or a traumatic brain injury does. But so the brain detects either there was never an injury, detects that incorrectly, or it's healed, but I still know 24/7 I have a glucose limitation. So then the brain takes a little step from you have a glucose insufficiency to you're insufficient. There's something wrong with me as a person. And I have never seen anybody with any glucose limiting injury that didn't have some level of that interpretation. That in some way, somehow, I'm not quite like other people. That's the minor version. I'm not quite good enough. There's something wrong with me. And then, like I talked about earlier, as those injuries accumulate, then it's, I'm defective. I'm not good enough. People can't like me. I can't be accepted. And then I'm worthless. And what happens is you develop a frame of reference based on what happens to you and what your brain labels as being the problem. And those frames of reference are very powerful. They even go, in my opinion, go beyond a belief system and go beyond the thoughts of just maybe I'm not quite good enough, or maybe that person doesn't like me, or maybe I can't do this or that. So a couple of ways to think about a frame of reference that hopefully will make it clear. Skin color is a very powerful frame of reference. Unfortunately, people with other than white skin color in our society, often their frame of reference is, I'm scrutinized more carefully, I'm not quite as good as, I'm a second-class citizen, I'm defective, simply because of my skin color. And when a policeman pulls them over for no clear reason, that reinforces that interpretation. When they don't get the job, that reinforces that interpretation and that frame of reference. I can look and see my skin color and I know I'm different. And because they have a glucose limitation, which everybody has, their brain is telling them you're insufficient. Oh, well, it's got to be this. It's got to be my ethnicity or my race. Or, and sorry to pick on you ladies for a second, but in our society, if you're a female and you don't have a certain number for your weight or certain dimensions, you're treated as less worthy. You're treated as insufficient. You're treated as not good enough, that something's wrong with me. And your husband or your friends can say, I love you, you're beautiful, I accept you completely, and it's, well, yeah, but if I lost 5 pounds, you'd love me more. That's an inaccurate frame of reference based on glucose insufficiency, based on your brain telling you you're not good enough at a fundamental level. Not you're injured, but you're defective. And then we develop those frames of reference. If you've experienced rejection in your life, it's easy to develop a frame of reference of, I'm going to be rejected. I know I have friends, and I know my friends like me, and my friends have stood by me for 20 years, but deep, deep down, I still know I'm going to be rejected. If that's your frame of reference, there's going to be distance between you and other people. You're going to interpret that raise of the eyebrow or offhanded comment, or even maybe you could have done this differently. You're going to interpret that as, oh, I'm being rejected, because that's your deep down frame of reference of insufficiency, all based on glucose limiting injuries. So it's very, very, very critical for, one, the glucose limiting injuries to heal, and then for people to be aware of what frame of reference have they adopted. One of the ones I did, and I probably had, I don't know, 15, 20, probably 15 or 20 concussions, and then a bunch of glucose-limiting injuries other than that. And one of the frames of reference I developed was, I've got to be responsible for making sure that my family is completely supported all the time. And I've got to have a plan and a secondary plan and a tertiary plan and a quaternary, anyway, whatever that word is, plan. My frame of reference is I'm always vulnerable because of glucose insufficiency, so I've got to have stacked up plans as a hedge against that vulnerability. Instead of understanding there isn't any limitation in me at all, that it's all injury-based, and I don't have to invest all that time and energy in trying to protect myself and my family. So, very important to understand how frame of reference operates in the context of glucose-limiting injuries. Yes, that's a great question, and we're going right there. So, you are doing so great. Did you have my notes? So the treatment is very, very simple. It's taking glucose. You can buy glucose tablets, glucose gummies at Walgreens, Walmart, Target, over the counter. Dextrose and glucose are the same thing. And so you can buy dextrose powder like at Natural Grocers or sometimes at Whole Foods or online. And so I don't know if everybody heard Ronnie's question, but he said, well, if the glucose is being limited to the brain, how can you get glucose to your brain? There are, and this is theoretical, if anybody wants to sign up afterwards for a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap, that would help me understand exactly what's happening. I so far haven't gotten anybody to do that. But we would need to do that to know exactly what's happening with glucose. But what we do know, certainly beyond any doubt, is by taking glucose that way, it gets directly to the brain and bypasses that limiting factor. So there are 4 what are called glucose transport mechanisms. And we think, don't know for sure, technology really isn't available other than a lumbar puncture to measure this, but we think that 1 or 2 of those glucose transporters allows glucose that you take in that form to get directly to your brain. What I do know, and this does not happen with everybody, and I'll explain more about this in a few minutes, but in some cases, like the very first person I ever treated, he came in, he'd had 30, 40 concussions, 41-year-old guy. One of the tests, neuropsychological tests I do, is I give people a sheet of paper. On the top, there's a key that has symbols in a top box and numbers in the bottom. Down below, there are symbols, and they have to put the numbers that go with the symbols. I put that page in front of him. 41-year-old man starts weeping. He says, that looks like somebody took a box of puzzle pieces and turned it over, and I can't even make sense of it. So he didn't have enough glucose for his brain to organize and interpret visual information. So I said, I've never done this before, I've researched it and it's safe, but I don't know if it'll do anything or not. But are you willing to try? Which is not really the best sales job, but. So he said, sure, why not? So he took some glucose, and probably within 20 seconds, he turns to his wife and says, you know that pressure that's always in my head? She says, yeah. He said, it's gone. She said, no, it's not. He said, no, it's gone. So that does not happen with everybody for some reasons I'll explain. But it gets to your brain almost instantaneously, and there are those glucose transport mechanisms that make sure you get glucose because of its vital function in life, maintaining survival. So by taking it, again, it bypasses that limiting system and fuels the brain directly. And for some people, it can take a couple of months for their symptoms to start diminishing and going away. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the research on starvation, but when children or adults or really people of any age have been malnourished or starved, they have to slowly introduce nutrition so that the body can absorb it, so it doesn't get overwhelmed, so it doesn't reject it. Apparently, that happens with some people's brains. that it takes some time for the brain to absorb it, for it to be metabolized. But when the brain gets fully fueled, all those symptoms that I talked about, headaches and brain fog and tinnitus and anxiety and anger and depression and hallucinations and attention problems and difficulties with autism, all of that goes away. Yes. I'll answer that. Let me preface it. At this point, I've collected data on about 250 people with a wide variety of conditions. All of them have glucose-limiting injuries. Some of them have diagnoses of autism. Some of them have diagnoses of post-concussion syndrome. Some of them have diagnoses of dementia. Some of them have diagnoses of schizophrenia. Some of them have diagnoses of bipolar disorder. Some of them have major depression. Some of them have PTSD. In my research so far, everybody that's completed treatment has completely recovered. Now, to talk about the physical symptoms, I think I've treated 2 people that had some difficulty with high blood pressure, and taking glucose brought it back to normal. 2 people is not really enough to make any kind of definitive statements, but in those cases, it has done that. It's fascinating. A lot of times when I treat people, they'll say, well, I've got type 2 diabetes or I've got type 1 diabetes. Can I do this? And when I first started doing the treatment, it was, no, you can't. That you can't take sugar when you're diabetic. And so I had a couple of people that were persistent and said, really, I've had so much trouble with these concussions, or I've had so much trouble with anger or whatever. Please, can I try? So I said, well, go to your doctor, and if your doctor says yes, then okay, we'll do it. And your doctor can monitor. So what I found is people with type 1 diabetes, people with type 2 diabetes, as they take glucose, their blood glucometer readings consistently drop. I treated a college girl not too long ago, and she had an insulin pump. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 2 or 3 years old. As she took glucose, her insulin pump activated less and less and less frequently, and her doctor said her diabetes was better controlled than it had ever been. Actually, her blood sugars returned to normal, and with no change in insulin or anything else. Do people know what A1C is? It's the long-term measure of sugar in your blood. So if you're going to have a physical, a lot of times your doctor will say fast for 12 hours before you take the test. One of the big reasons is they don't want your blood sugar to be elevated because you just had food. So they will measure your blood sugar. Usually it's about a 3-month average. And as people have taken glucose, their A1C numbers have dropped as well. So to date, physical conditions like diabetes, a couple of cases of people with cardiac or cardiovascular problems, people with neuropathy, some people, a couple of cases of people with rheumatoid arthritis, the pain went away. Again, there's not enough cases to make definitive statements about some of those things, but everybody that's been treated has recovered. So let's talk for a minute about the dose. Typically, I have people start somewhere around 24 to 28 grams at a time of glucose 4 times a day, including once at bedtime. And I treat a good number of military veterans who have combat exposure, PTSD. As they take a dose at bedtime, their nightmares go away, and their sleep is stabilized. So that's where I start, like I said, is 28 grams 4 times a day, including once at bedtime. About, in my experience, and again, this is a couple of hundred cases, about 20 to 30% of people will completely recover simply by taking that dose of glucose and not really doing anything else. And that includes migraines, that includes balance problems, that includes all of the symptoms that we've talked about. About 50% of people need consultation on the dose and need a higher dose than that. The guy that I told you about that went through the windshield and had the medically induced coma, he was taking 240 grams at a time, 4 times a day. And one of the other guys I told you about that had the probably 40 or 50 concussions and went to prison and then, had the construction accident where he lost consciousness. He was taking, or no, still is actually, but he's just about finished, but was taking 150 grams at a time, 6 times a day. And so when he had that incident that I told you about, where he lost ability to move his arms and legs, the paramedics came, they said, "What medication are you taking?" And he said, "Oh, and I should probably tell you, I'm taking 150 grams of glucose 6 times a day." They nearly fell out of their truck. And they said, "Well, we better do a glucometer test." So he, and I don't remember exactly how long it had been since his last dose, but it had been less than 3 or 4 hours. They did the glucometer reading, and his blood sugar was 105. Anything under 100 is completely normal. So he'd been taking that amount of glucose for several months, and his blood sugar was normal, basically. Yes? So Ronnie's question was, I think you said if it's successful. At this point, I would say as it's successful. Do you keep taking it or can you stop? So the most common amount of time people need to take it is about 6 months. Sometimes 5, sometimes 7, but around 6 is the most common. Then they can stop taking the glucose and the symptoms don't come back. And people have stopped their psychotropic medication, their antipsychotic medication, their bipolar medication, and not had any return of symptoms after stopping the glucose. A little caveat to that is I recommend everybody, and actually I do it myself, I don't have my briefcase with me, but I recommend that people keep some glucose with them, because like we were talking about earlier, like with stress, you can burn too much glucose in the moment and have a little deficit, just like if you went out and climbed Pikes Peak. You're going to need to drink water, right? Because you get a little underhydrated. Doesn't mean you have a hydration problem. It just means you have burned too much fluid. You can burn too much glucose in the moment, even after you recovered, and having some to supplement is helpful. If you don't have it to supplement, you just wait till your next meal and then all the symptoms will go away. And like I mentioned, our brains are so magnificent at informing us of low glucose. We just haven't known how to interpret those symptoms before. So if I get a little headache, if I get a little brain fog, if I get a little word-finding difficulty because I've seen patients all day and then did trainings or whatever, I'll usually take about 24 to 28 grams once, and all the symptoms are gone and I'm fine. Yes? So yeah, Amy mentioned how much do kids need? The youngest person I've treated so far is 18 months. And that was a baby who her mom came to me because of a motor vehicle accident. And terrible timing. She happened to be unbuckling the car seat to adjust the baby right when they got rear-ended. This had been a happy baby, slept well, content, right from the time of that accident on, screaming almost continuously, not sleeping, not eating. So I had that infant take 2 grams at a time, 3 times a day, for about 3 or 4 weeks. And all of the crying stopped, all of the sleeping problems stopped, appetite returned to normal. So a 5-year-old would probably be more like 8 to 10 grams I would start with, and then kind of titrate it up until we get to the place where there are no symptoms. And that's the way to know the brain is fully fueled, when there are 0 symptoms. Again, no headache, no brain fog, no anxiety, no irritability, all of that stuff is gone. Yes, she said, any research on side effects? Some people, I would say maybe 10%, get kind of an intermittent upset stomach taking it. Occasionally, and this is maybe 2 or 3%, get a little worse headache the first couple of days to maybe a week of taking it because they're not used to that influx of sugar, but that goes away. Glucose is as natural in your body as blood is. If you don't have glucose, you're dead. So there are no long-term side effects just because glucose is in your body 24/7. A portion of everything we eat, our body converts to glucose. And the other part of that is you only take it for around 6 months and then you stop. Other than some people have kept taking it just because they wanted to see if there would be continued improvement. And there's actually a couple of people I'm tracking. One guy's an MMA fighter. And so he came to me, he'd had who knows how many concussions, high anxiety, terrible memory. He literally, this will sound kind of funny, but it wasn't funny to him at all. He got lost in the bathroom of his work. He literally had no idea where he was or even how to get out of the stall. He completely recovered, except, so he had stopped taking the glucose. He wasn't having any symptoms. But then he called me a couple weeks later and he said, I still get a little anxious. I said, are you still fighting? Well, yeah. He's sparring 3 times a week. So I said, well, listen, you really got to stop fighting. When you keep injuring your brain over and over and over again, you're going to keep having some symptoms. Yeah, but I love it, and blah, blah, blah. So I said, well, I don't know what to tell you. So he said, okay, thanks. Then calls back 3 or 4 months later. I'm still having some anxiety. You still fighting? Yeah. So finally we came up with a plan. I said, why don't you take 5 or 6 tablets, which is about 20 to 24 grams at a time every day, just continuously, if you're going to keep fighting. And we'll meet every 6 months or so, and I'll tell you if I see some cognitive decline, and then you're going to have another decision to make. He said, great. So he's been doing that for a couple years now, and he's had no increase in symptoms, no return of memory difficulties, no problem whatsoever. Then I have another guy that he said, I kind of like this. He said, can I keep taking it? I said, there's no harm. And so we're monitoring to see if his cognitive function can improve even beyond what we thought was his baseline ability. And so far, that's happening. He continues to improve in his job function. His memory continues to improve as he continues to take it. Yeah. Tinnitus is kind of an interesting one. I would say there's probably been out of 250-ish people, probably 5 whose tinnitus did not completely go away, but everybody's has reduced, and 99-point-something%, I don't do trig on the fly very well, 99-point-something%, the tinnitus is completely gone. Ear ringing. Yeah, yes. All of a sudden, you'll start noticing, like, again, that guy that went through the windshield, very, very bright guy. When I first started seeing him, he said, if I really, really, really work hard, I can read 70 pages a week. By the time we finished treatment, he was reading 700 pages a week and retaining it all. If there's any parents of teenagers in here, you may want to listen to this. So I was treating a college girl, and her parents had a little consternation over her lack of cleaning her room. And so she was doing the treatment, and she said, one day, I just thought, well, let me start trying to clean my room. And she said, then like 15 minutes later, it was all clean. And it's been clean ever since. And just kind of, quote unquote, out of nowhere, she started cleaning her room. I treated a guy that does presentations for a living. He said, I noticed all of a sudden, I can do a presentation and I have these ideas that fit perfectly that I didn't prepare for, and they're just there. Another woman, she was an insurance actuary, and she would have to key in 7 or 8 digit numbers all day. When she first came to me, she said, well, I can check it, and then I'll do the first 2 or 3 numbers, and I'll check it again and do the next several numbers and check it again, and then I'll have to double check again to make sure I got it. By the time treatment ended, she said, I look at it once and it's there and it's always right. And you'll notice no more ear ringing, no more headache, no more anxiety, no more depression. Yes, there's 0 glucose in the food you eat.
It's not in fruit.
Nope. Nope. Sorry. Although, this is kind of interesting. The little Smarties candy that come in those tubes, that is dextrose. And there's 30% of honey is dextrose. But it's not in any other foods. It doesn't matter because that valve has been turned down. So you could eat every carb and every kind of sucrose or fructose. You could eat tons of cake. You're not going to get any more glucose to your brain because of the limitation. It's got to be glucose. No, it's not that the body isn't converting it. It's that the brain limits it from coming in from the body. So you're still getting glucose. It's kind of interesting. Like alcohol cravings very often are due to accumulated head injury because the brain kind of intuitively knows the high carb content and sugar content should give more glucose. But it doesn't because the valve has regulated it down and you're not going to get it that way. You have to get it this other way of actually taking the already made glucose. And that's the unanswered question. I think it's because of the glucose transport mechanisms. I think there may be some mucosal absorption of the actual glucose that goes straight to your brain, so your body doesn't have to convert it. So I apologize, I don't have a great answer to that question. But what I do know from these couple hundred cases is by taking it this way, your brain gets fully fueled and all the symptoms go away. And I do pre and post neuropsychological testing with everybody I treat. So kind of like to your question, it isn't just, well, I kind of feel better. It's not that placebo effect or, well, I just kind of think I feel better and I can, and I could talk them into it. You can't fake good on a neuropsychological test. You can't be better than you are. And I would say on average, I see about a standard deviation, or to put it in other terms, like a letter grade and a standard deviation and a half or a letter grade and a half improvement from pre-treatment to post-treatment. And it's different tests. So it's not just they're better at taking that test. It's a different test. And so that very scientific in terms of establishing the outcomes. And so people roughly some of our age, I don't want to discriminate, but think it's normal to have trouble finding words sometimes. Like I'm in a conversation and I can't think of the word. People think that's normal. It's not normal. That's glucose limitation. People think it's normal to be kind of mentally fatigued at the end of the day. It's not normal. That's glucose limitation. People think it's normal to feel stressed out. That's not normal. People think it's normal to have periodic headaches. None of that is normal.
So we don't know, most of us don't know that.
Right, yeah, we've never known that before. Yeah, and so if you'll promise not to hit me, I'm going to say something. Just like the MMA fighter, and I dearly love football, so take this maybe with a grain of salt, but your son could keep playing with no risk.
Oh, he's done, thank you.
Okay,
He does track.
okay. But people can keep playing football or hockey or MMA because it's fascinating that once you've recovered, then you have the next glucose limiting injury, which all of you will have. I've probably had 3 or 4 this past year. That will happen, but when that happens, you just need to resume taking the glucose at the dose you were taking. Take it for about a week, give or take. All the symptoms will be gone and the limitation won't happen. So you're never going to have to worry about a concussive injury again. And I don't have longitudinal data yet, so take this with a grain of salt, maybe several grains. But I've treated people in their 80s that their first concussive injury that they knew about was when they were 3 or 4 or 5 years old. They have completely recovered. People with Alzheimer's diagnoses have completely recovered. Gone. Or, there's been about 5 people total out of 250 where it wasn't completely gone, just went from like a 6 or a 7 to a 1 or a 2. But my belief is, and I'm actively collecting data all the time, that this will prevent dementia, that this will prevent cognitive problems as we age. Because as our brain stays fully fueled, it will continue to function the way it should. So I should probably, one more question, and then I'll turn it back over to Dan. Typically, I would say increase by about 8 grams a week, and then keep going until all the symptoms are gone. Yeah. And then, so like I said, about 20% of people need regular consultation or treatment. And so if you keep taking it and it's not getting better, it probably needs a little bit more intervention. But again, so far, 250 or so cases, based on pre and post neuropsychological testing, everybody's recovered that's finished treatment.
So it's 8 grams one tablet?
A tablet is 4 grams. Yeah.
And that's increased 8 grams per dosage, meaning 4 times?
Yeah, per dose, yes. Yep. All right, Dan?
Yeah. We worked our way up to 52 grams 4 times a day over, I think now we're about 5.5 months in. And I didn't realize that it would have the profound impact. I had tinnitus that was distracting, and it's gone, completely gone. I had worked in the oil field in 2012 and gotten up to 389 pounds, not on purpose, working 16 to 22-hour days, living, sleeping in a truck that was set up as an office in the oil field. They taught us how to nap our way through life, like Edison and Tesla and those guys. I wouldn't suggest that for anyone. I tried and tried and tried to lose weight, and I couldn't, and I had a lot of trouble. But down from 389 to 280 and not done yet. It's pretty amazing.
Just a couple more things and we'll wrap up. So one thing I didn't mention, that you cannot take enough glucose to be harmful. I don't know if people know what LD50 is. That stands for lethal dose 50. It's a chemical description. You would have to take, for generally adults, you would have to take 2,800 grams all at once to even have a 50% chance of dying. And to put that in context, that would be 700 tablets at once, which is obviously impossible to do. So it's completely safe. So to close, just a couple of things. I think as I've said, and I think Dan said, I'm a neuropsychologist. I've been practicing neuropsychology off and on my whole career. Have done assessments, neuropsychological assessments of people in the state mental hospital and jails and prisons and all kinds of contexts. So about 4 years ago, with all this increased interest in concussion, I decided, well, I'm going to really try to figure out what's happening with concussions. Did the research and found out little, like here and there and somewhere else, there was reference to glucose being a problem in concussions. I was doing this research, and so one night in the middle of the night, I'm awakened with the thought, try glucose, which probably I'm the only one in this room that has ever had that happen. You can let me know if you have. I interpreted that. I don't know where everybody in this room is in terms of if you're a people of faith or not. You could easily interpret that as, well, that's just a combination of my study, and brains continue to process information all the time, and so that's what happened. I actually choose to interpret it as that was inspiration from God. And so remember I said at the beginning that the inspiration for this work was the world's greatest living neuroscientist? That's God, in my opinion. God is the one that revealed this to me. So I had a follow-up dream, probably a week or two later, and it wasn't an audible voice, but almost as clear as if it was dictation. I've said enough, I meaning God, I've said enough to the damage and destruction caused by concussions and injuries. And I'm choosing to pour out my love by providing a way for people to heal. One of the most amazing things is it honestly doesn't matter whether you believe in God or don't believe in God. It doesn't matter if you think, well, yeah, whatever, it's science, it was a result of study, doesn't matter. In my opinion, this is something God is offering to everybody regardless of what they think about him or don't think about him. He's providing a way for people to heal. And in my field, in the mental health field, healing isn't a word that anybody uses. I mean, we talk about managing. We talk about symptom improvement. For addiction, a 30% recovery rate is a great number. For mental illness, I mean, nobody even talks about recovery, meaning healing or complete vanishing of symptoms and return to full function. So many people tell me, you've given me my life back. I never thought I could feel this way. You've given me my kid back. I treated a guy with autism, an adult, and he had spent most of his adolescent years in a state mental hospital in a different state due to autism. As an adult, he unwisely chose to drink alcohol kind of frequently, and that does not mix well with autism. So I had a couple of incidents where he wound up in, one incident he wound up in prison, another incident he wound up in jail. And then he was on probation from his most recent episode, which was he was headed off to water ski, which he loved to do, and somebody was ahead of him in the drive-up window at the bank on a Friday afternoon. So he had been drinking, and he pushed the car through the drive-up window, which is not advisable. He wound up with another charge and longer probation. Then I'd been doing this treatment for maybe 6 months, and he had another charge. And so I had been to court and said to the judge in previous infractions, well, he does pretty well when he's on probation, when he's monitored. I had been the chief of behavioral health for the Colorado prison system, and I said, prison is not where he belongs. Let's keep him in the community, but he needs to have the longest probation period possible because he does well when he has that structure of probation. So this most recent case, I said, you can look at the court records. I was in here a couple years ago and argued for the longest period of probation possible. I think now he's going to recover. And so I would like to have him stay in the community, do this treatment, and reconsider his probation in a year, because I think he's going to be recovered. He did the neuropsychological testing. We did the treatment. He was a guy that had a very difficult time not having 40 or 50% of his sentences be the F word. And it was really, I called it treatment, but it wasn't. Because if I tried to say something, he would talk louder and faster to drown me out. About halfway through the treatment, we started having normal conversations. His mother, whom he was living with, even though he was 40-ish years old, his mother said, he has said, damn, once in 6 months and hasn't cussed at all other than that. On neuropsychological testing, he improved by 3 standard deviations or 3 letter grades across the board. Now has a job, has friends, interacts with people, completely recovered. I mean, that's miraculous. And again, this is something, in my opinion, and you can take glucose and you don't have to believe in God at all and you'll recover. But this is something from him, really a blessing from him. And so we'll close on that note. Thank you.